This presentation is a re-recording of a presentation given on a webinar on March 6, 2019, which had some technical difficulties. And so now some of the information is a little bit outdated, but the basic content of the presentation is still relevant. And we are re-recording this presentation to make it available to members of the public. So thanks everybody for joining. My name is Tim Judson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Nuclear Information and Resource Service, which is a national nonprofit organization that is dedicated to providing information and resources to people at the local and grassroots level who are concerned about issues of nuclear power, radioactive waste, and sustainable energy. We have been monitoring the situation in Pennsylvania with the proposed nuclear subsidy legislation that has been introduced, and are very proud to stand here with our colleagues in Pennsylvania to provide some information and some perspective and some context to what Pennsylvania is dealing with, in part based on what we have been seeing happen and have been involved in other states throughout the Northeast and Midwest. So the situation with the nuclear subsidies that are proposed in Pennsylvania is really, part of a broader national trend that has been going on for several years now. And among the other things that it's important to understand is that when we're talking about nuclear power, we're talking about a very mature industry that's existed for over 6 decades. And has had a very long history of subsidies and bailouts throughout that time, including all of the reactors that are currently operating in Pennsylvania and that are the subject of the current legislation that's before the Pennsylvania State House. So, to talk about this really in perspective, because the industry is busy claiming that that they're disadvantaged in the current policy environment, that renewable energy and energy efficiency enjoy a number of subsidies and incentives, and that nuclear is excluded from. And this is really inaccurate and out of context. Nuclear power already enjoys enormous subsidies, both direct and indirect subsidies, both historical and current. And these were documented in a report by the Union of Concerned Scientists from a few years ago called "Nuclear Power Still Viable Without Subsidies." It was really one of the first attempts to kind of give a comprehensive perspective on subsidies for the nuclear power industry. And that's includes both direct and indirect subsidies. And the indirect subsidies in particular are ongoing and continuous. The direct subsidies for the current generation of reactors are mostly historical, but that in fact have led to the current economic conditions that the industry is facing. That includes subsidies for the original construction of these reactors, many of which were built under policies that were very generous, called construction work in progress, or turnkey contracts by the reactors manufacturers, that essentially, had all of the risk of the construction costs absorbed by ratepayers or by the manufacturers in the first cases. Despite these enormous benefits, there were significant cost overruns, schedule and construction delays, which led to some near bankruptcies of a number of utilities in the country. This led to what Forbes described as the largest managerial disaster in business history, a disaster what they characterize as on a monumental scale. Then, about 10 years after, this experience of the original construction cost overruns, the industry found itself, supporting the deregulation of the electricity markets in the Northeast and Midwest and other parts of the country, to essentially move to competitive markets. And as essentially the price for adopting this new deregulation, the utilities got states to provide another round of bailouts for the stranded costs, the stranded debts, basically the bad debts that these reactors had incurred, to essentially move these reactors into the deregulation environment without any debt burdens going forward. That cost ratepayers over the course of the next 10 to 20 years about $86 billion in these stranded cost bailouts. Those are 1997 dollars. The present value of that subsidy would have been about 137 billion in today's dollars. So, in Pennsylvania's share of that for the 9 reactors that are still operating was about $9 billion in 1996 dollars, or about $15 billion in today's dollars. So this was a substantial public investment, in essentially making or absolving these reactors of all of their original construction and maintenance debts. That was, again, over 20 years ago now, and these reactors are much, much older. And this is a trend that's affecting much of the nuclear industry, which is that these machines are now mostly past their originally licensed lifespans, was 40 years. And as a result, their major components and a lot of other smaller components are aging out and needing to be replaced, and the maintenance costs are going up. And so, the competitive pressures that the industry is experiencing are not only because market prices have declined over the last decade, but also because the cost of running these reactors is going up as they age. And what you see in this little chart from a report that was issued a few years ago is essentially the trend line of where nuclear reactor operating costs are relative to market prices and natural gas prices. And that red line that is slightly going up is now above the blue line, which is market electricity prices and PJM. So, things to sort of know about this trend. So maintenance costs for reactors, operating maintenance costs are increasing. Energy demand is decreasing. So the size of the market has been stagnant or declining. Electricity prices are decreasing in this environment as well. And the emergence of solar, wind, energy efficiency, and now storage and other renewable energy sources are rising. Are falling and maturing to a degree that the long-term prospects for nuclear are just not there. And the industry is seeking these subsidies and bailouts as a way to basically remain in operation in this environment where they can't really sustain themselves long term. Part of the consequence of this is that states are now confronting some realities about what the future shape of the electricity market is going to look like. And one of the seminal events occurred about in 2016, 3 years ago, when Pacific Gas and Electric recognized that under California's 50% renewable energy standard, that the future operations of the last remaining nuclear plant in California, Diablo Canyon, we're basically going to be incompatible with an increasingly renewable energy grid. Essentially, wind and solar, need a flexible grid with some energy storage, and nuclear is the sort of the penultimate of the inflexible baseload model of generation that the previous electric grid that's heavily fossil fuel dependent is based on. And during times when solar is peaking in California, the PG&E's forecast showed that nuclear was going to be causing massive amounts of congestion in the transmission system and either forcing the curtailment of solar or requiring expensive transmission workarounds that really made the energy costs unsustainable. So they agreed to phase out Diablo Canyon by the time its licenses expire in 2024 and 2025, and to increase renewables and energy efficiency, so that by 2031, PG&E will be exceeding California's 50% renewable energy target, and also ramping up energy efficiency to achieve additional demand reductions, so that the closure of Diablo Canyon will actually lead to an acceleration of renewable energy deployment and energy efficiency. One of the other reasons that the industry is seeking these subsidies is essentially to defer billion-dollar liabilities for decommissioning, which they feel unprepared to shoulder, and especially for those that are running in deregulated environments. They can't just go back to ratepayers to pay for any cost overruns that have been very common in the decommissioning of reactors in various states where they've occurred. The shortfalls that are typical in the decommissioning trust funds essentially constitute major liabilities that they're seeking to defer. And that's one of the major reasons why they want to prolong the operation of these reactors for as long as possible, to keep those liabilities off their balance sheets. So just to underscore the point, the age of reactors worldwide is getting close to retirement age. But in the U.S., in fact, our average nuclear fleet is much older, at over 38 years in 2018, and now in 2019 we'll be at 39 years on average. But that means that the majority of reactors in the country are past the 40-year original license period and are into the period of their first relicensing. Now, the consequence of this is that nuclear is entering its wear out period. And the industry has always been subject to what's called the bathtub curve regarding both nuclear safety risks, but also economics. Because of the very high cost of building these reactors early on, their operating costs were high in the early years, and they experienced some maintenance needs due to equipment that wasn't installed properly or were defective. But by the time they reached their middle lifespans in around 20 years, and many of them were subject to these stranded cost bailouts as well, their operating costs were sort of at the bottom of the bathtub curve. But now that they're reaching the wear out phase with increasing equipment failures, original manufacturer equipment is not available anymore, so they're retrofitting things. The costs of maintenance are going, and the cost of operating these reactors is going up and up and up. And so what you saw was, through the period of the 2000s up to the 2010s, the operating costs, the average operating costs throughout the U.S. nuclear industry were climbing dramatically, increasing by over 50% in the 10-year period between 2002 and 2012. And now that we're approaching a second period of, either license expirations, or as they're doing at Peach Bottom, a second round of relicensing out to 80 years, we're likely to see yet another round of cost escalation as the operators need to make safety upgrades or equipment upgrades in order to support their continued operation. So what's happened is, the industry is in a period of uncertainty, and after having launched what they called a nuclear renaissance in the 20-aughts, to build a new generation of nuclear reactors, which was an unmitigated failure. Over 30 reactors were proposed and had license applications submitted to NRC. 28 of those have now been canceled or indefinitely postponed, and only 2 are under construction, and those are over $14 billion over budget and over 5 years behind schedule. So there's no prospects of new reactors coming online. And so the industry, confronted with this reality, as of 2013, also faced an unprecedented wave of reactor closures, with 5 reactors, closure announcements coming in the period of about a year, which had never happened at that pace before. In fact, prior to, for a 15-year period from just prior to deregulation to 2013, there had been no retirements of nuclear reactors after there had just been about 10 reactor closures in the 1990s. So this was, sort of a signal to the industry that there had been a sea change in the economic conditions of the industry. And in 2014, the major players in the industry launched a push for these new subsidies and bailouts for old reactors. In Illinois, Exelon sort of made its first stand by blocking renewable energy legislation that had been queued up to fix the state's renewable energy standard, basically demanding that it would not allow any renewable energy legislation to proceed in Illinois until it had received a bailout for its uneconomic nuclear reactors. In Ohio, First Energy pushed the legislature to suspend the renewable energy and energy efficiency standards as it proposed a massive bailout for its coal and nuclear units in the state. And then in New York, Exelon, proposed it was going to close one of its reactors in New York without a subsidy there as well, and queued up a reliability study which showed that the state was going to need to support the continued operation of that reactor until transmission upgrades had been adopted. But none of these bailout measures really, went forward until 2016, when New York Governor Cuomo really pushed through what was called a clean energy standard, which involved a 50% RPS as well as this massive subsidy to prevent the closures of more reactors in New York. Following on that, Illinois passed the Clean Energy Jobs Act as a compromise demanded by the legislature to force environmentalists and Exelon to the table to come up with a way to move forward on energy policy. It's worth saying that especially in the case of Illinois, which is similar in some ways to what's happening in Pennsylvania, that there was essentially it wasn't that the nuclear subsidies were packaged with renewable energy subsidies. This was really the result of a 2.5 year pitched fight between Exelon and environmentalists over what direction the state was going to go in on energy policy, and that renewable energy legislation, would never have happened, if not for, the nuclear subsidy would not have happened except for essentially the staunch opposition of the environmental groups to giving Exelon this handout, and the renewable energy legislation was essentially the price for Exelon to get its bailout. Now, so far there's 4 states that have passed nuclear subsidies. In addition to New York and Illinois, New Jersey and Connecticut have also adopted nuclear subsidy programs. This now amounts to about 13 reactors being subsidized to the tune of $15 billion by 2030. These programs are all structured slightly differently than one another. New York's is definitely the most expensive so far. But these are, but it has also become clear that the issue for the industry is not that reactors are currently unprofitable that they're seeking subsidies for. Especially, this has been made clear in New Jersey and Connecticut. The reactors that are now being subsidized are still quite profitable, but what the owners are saying is that they're simply not profitable enough to justify continuing to operate them. And so what the subsidy in New Jersey was designed to do is to essentially underwrite an 18% rate of return on investment for the 3 reactors that are continuing to operate in New Jersey, which is quite a bit higher than even what the very generous rates of return that are guaranteed to utilities through rate making amount to. So this is really a situation where the industry, even profitably, knows that there's risks that they don't want to take long term, and so they're basically asking ratepayers to subsidize even profitable reactors in order to guarantee their continued operation. Now, these have really been uneconomical investments, even from a climate perspective, because of the opportunity costs involved. So in New York, for instance, this is a $7.6 billion subsidy over the 12 years of the program to these 4 reactors. And that, means that New Yorkers are spending $7.5 billion on these nuclear subsidies that could be spent on other things besides supporting nuclear. And when you look at it in that way, it's very clear that this is a wasteful subsidy that could, that could be, and that New York could achieve much better long-term emissions reduction measures, through making other choices. So, the $7.5 billion subsidy for the nuclear plants is basically preserving about 27 million megawatt hours a year of electricity from these 4 reactors, which will continue through 2020 or through early 2029. Now, the state has a 2030 emissions target of 40% reductions relative to 1990 levels. But the problem is that 2 of the 4 reactors that are being subsidized are among the oldest in the world, and their licenses are expiring in 2029. And so these reactors are going to close, before 2030, regardless of the subsidy. And another one of those reactors was known to be unprofitable for the subsidy and was announced that it was going to close. And so there's no reason to think that that at least 3 of these reactors, if not all 4, are going to continue operating after the subsidy program expires. So from a state emissions target perspective, there's a really tough case to make that this was worth it. But even in any case, compared to the cost of the renewable energy credits that are projected, through 2030 to meet the state's 50% renewable energy target, the cost of the nuclear subsidy is about 3 times greater than what the state will spend on renewable energy credits for a lower amount of energy. So, in effect, the tier 1 renewable energy standard is about 2 to 6 times more cost effective than the nuclear subsidies at mitigating carbon. In addition to that, the state has yet to fully implement any kind of energy efficiency standards. They're just starting to do that now. But at the time that the nuclear subsidies were under consideration, environmental groups proposed setting an energy efficiency standard as part of the Clean Energy Standard. And they produced a detailed report that showed that the state could achieve very significant, energy demand reductions in New York, effectively equivalent to the amount of electricity that the nuclear plants that are being subsidized generate, at a net cost savings to consumers of $3 billion. So effectively, in terms of the 2030 emissions target for New York, the state could have achieved, greater levels of emissions reduction at a net cost savings to consumers of $600 million by opting for energy efficiency instead of nuclear. And this is essentially a $10 billion cost difference between the net cost of the nuclear and renewable energy credits, versus what the state could have done with energy efficiency and renewables in tandem. Now, the Rocky Mountain Institute also produced an analysis that basically confirmed that this is really the way to think about the opportunity cost of nuclear subsidies. That energy efficiency is essentially 2 to 3 times cheaper than subsidizing nuclear power plants. It both avoids the cost of the nuclear subsidies as well as the operating costs. The purchasing of the wholesale price of the electricity. And essentially, utility programs could buy 2 to 3 kilowatt hours of energy efficiency for every nuclear kilowatt hour avoided. Now, that largely depends on how much nuclear you're talking about. And in a state like Pennsylvania, where there's such a large amount of nuclear electricity generated, you could really think of it in terms of a combination of energy efficiency and renewables being more cost effective rather than just energy efficiency. So the legislation that's been introduced in Pennsylvania sort of takes this whole paradigm a step further. It's really the largest, most expensive subsidy that we've seen yet. The initial proposal that was released would have cost somewhere on the order of $880 million a year, or potentially up to $1 billion a year, depending on the price of the nuclear emissions credits. But what it does that is unique to the other states is it effectively sets, it sets a 50% nuclear energy standard, whereas, states are very familiar with renewable energy standards or renewable portfolio standards that set a target for achieving a certain percentage of electricity in the state from renewable sources like solar and wind. This bill sets a 50% nuclear energy standard, essentially forcing utilities in Pennsylvania to buy, credits, nuclear energy credits, equivalent to about a half of their annual electricity sales. So this effectively places a cap on the potential for renewable energy growth in Pennsylvania by allocating so much of the state's electricity, standard to nuclear. And this, really stands in the way of future renewable energy growth. And of course, the legislation also doesn't increase the current Tier 1 and Tier 2 alternative energy portfolio requirements of about 18%. So what we've sort of looked at is, alternatives to subsidizing nuclear in relation to states being able to meet their environmental and climate goals. And what we've proposed is, is a program for phase outs, not bailouts of nuclear reactors, and some practical, cost-effective ways that states can achieve that, especially, including in deregulated states like Pennsylvania, where you don't have the benefit of having utilities that are doing soup to nuts system planning with generation and transmission and distribution. So we published in November 2018 a white paper on reactor closures, and it's important to remember some things about the situation. First of all, that reactors will close sooner or later, but they're not all going to close at once. So in Pennsylvania, there are 3 reactors that are considered uneconomical that First Energy and Exelon are planning to close. And they are the smallest and oldest reactors, or among the oldest reactors in the state, that have a very high cost profile, and they likely are uncompetitive, and the utilities are making a business decision to close those. But the rest of the reactors in Pennsylvania are known to be quite profitable, and they are, much larger reactors that have much better economies of scale than the ones that are slated to close. So there's no reason to think that just because 3 Mile Island and Beaver Valley are scheduled to shut down, that Peach Bottom and Limerick and Susquehanna would follow suit anytime soon. Their economic profiles are just very different. But deregulated states need planning and transition tools to be able to approach these situations rationally and cost effectively. So what we've proposed is essentially a modification of the existing procedure by which states and grid operators ensure system reliability when power plants close. What's called the deactivation process. And we think that if you pair that in a parallel fashion with an emissions impact study as well as the reliability study that's done when a generator submits a deactivation notice, that you can essentially create a competitive process for addressing emissions impacts that the state thinks need to be mitigated. So, but what's necessary is, the states need supporting policies to be able to make this a rational process. So there need to be comprehensive emissions targets, for states to be able to weigh, changes in emissions in the electricity sector versus overall emissions in the states, with the changes that are happening in electrifying transportation and heating and increased efficiency, in other sectors as well. They also need effective renewable energy policies, policies that actually enable the growth of renewable energy, in a predictable and not too constrained fashion. There are states that are rapidly expanding renewable energy, not just California, but even Republican states, like Texas and Kansas and Iowa and Oklahoma, at very significant rates that make the transition to renewable energy a rapid transition to renewable energy quite feasible. But that it requires rational and and reasonable siting rules, procurement rules for obtaining renewable energy, transmission planning, and community programs like community solar. And then part of the political inertia that is contributing to the press for these bailouts are the very real local economic impacts of power plant closures. And so there need to be community and worker transition programs in place to be able to manage changes in the in the energy sector, without essentially leaving people behind in the process. And those need to be done up front so that workers and communities know that that when a power plant closure is coming, that they're that they're going that there's a path to the other side of that change for them. So this is a diagram that sort of shows, what we're proposing. And on the left-hand side is essentially the current process that takes place whenever a power plant closes. It starts with a deactivation notice. That's the first step. Then a reliability study is conducted by the grid operator to determine if there are any reliability impacts to that power plant closing, whether it's a shortage of supply or some other impact on the stability of the transmission system, essentially to make sure that there won't be any blackouts resulting from a power plant closing. If that study determines that there's no reliability impact, then that takes you down the green path to setting the retirement date and the power plant closing. If there is a reliability impact, they do a solicitation for reliability solutions to see what can be done cost effectively to mitigate that impact, without having to prolong the operation of the power plant. And if that solicitation turns up, other ways to address whatever the reliability problem is, then again you proceed to closing the power plant and moving ahead with those plans. Only if there is some temporary condition where other solutions can't be implemented cost effectively to mitigate the impact of the power plant closing, do you consider providing subsidies or a subsidized price to the power plant to make it possible for the owner to continue operating it. And so that is usually done with and that is usually done through what's called a reliability must-run contract that provides a subsidized price to the generator to cover its costs. And while the other reliability solutions are implemented, and then setting a retirement date for the plant, when those when the system reliability issues have been addressed, and then allowing the competitive market to resume. Now, there's no reason why a similar process can't be done with emissions impacts. Essentially following the same type of a process, the state would conduct a greenhouse gas emissions impact study when a reactor closure is announced. If there's no evidence that the state isn't going to be able to meet its emissions goals, following the closure of that reactor, then you would move to just allowing the reactor to close as the operator wants to. But if there is an impact, then that would need to involve a solicitation for solutions. Probably a combination of efficiency or renewables or even other emissions reductions in other sectors, like transportation, electric vehicle programs, or things like that, heat pump programs, or in the heating sector. And if that proves feasible to address the emissions impact, then you basically have a situation where you've got an accelerated deployment of renewables, efficiency, or other climate solutions, as a result of the reactor closing. Only if there's no feasible way to mitigate emissions impacts from a reactor closure would you provide financial support to that reactor to continue operating, and that essentially would then run in parallel to implementing other emissions reduction strategies while you're phasing out that reactor. So that's essentially the concept for how we think this can be done. And it's very similar to what's being done in California with the Diablo Canyon reactors. They have a 2025 closure date for the reactors. They know what they want to do to mitigate the impact, and that includes ramping up energy efficiency and renewable energy programs to meet a higher standard of renewables to make sure that when Diablo closes down, there's not going to be any sustained increase in emissions in the state. So all of that said, there are real reasons why we would want to take this approach. The notion that the nuclear is an emissions-free energy source only applies if you're looking narrowly at the emissions, of carbon dioxide at the reactor site. But the reality is that nuclear is every bit as dirty an energy source as coal and natural gas and petroleum. It involves a number of different other environmental impacts throughout its fuel chain. And is predicated on a level of environmental injustice from the ways that these impacts are allocated. Just from the mining of uranium itself and the production of the fuel that goes into a reactor, there's 5,000 pounds of radioactive waste that are created for every pound of fuel that goes into a reactor, in the form of waste rock from uranium mining, mill tailings at the mill tailing sites, and then a whole plethora of heavy metals and chemical contamination issues along with the radioactive waste that's produced. There's also about 7 or 8 times as much depleted uranium that's generated as the enriched uranium that goes into the fuel. And then what you're left with at the end is the irradiated or spent fuel that is 1 million times more radioactive when it comes out of the reactor than it was when it went in, and is going to remain an environmental hazard for up to 1 million years or more. These are really serious issues that have major consequences that need to be mitigated and taken seriously. Reactors also, routinely release radiation as part of their normal operations, both in gaseous and liquid form, as well as there being, pretty well documented leaks at almost every reactor site in the country. There is also the quote low-level radioactive waste that's generated routinely through the operations of reactors, and then the eventual massive amount of radioactive waste from decommissioning these plants when they're done. You also have the potential for very serious environmental disasters involving both reactor meltdowns and fires in spent fuel pools, which are potentially the most serious risks, in the industry. Could, render areas of tens of thousands of square miles uninhabitable for generations. And then you have the very serious impacts on ecosystems and water resources of the cooling systems of these reactors, which are the most water intensive of any source of generation, in the U.S. And routinely kill a lot of wildlife, as well as reduce water quality through thermal pollution, as well as the massive amounts of water it takes, which amount to billions of gallons of water a day at some plants. So with that, I'll conclude my presentation, and we'll be taking questions. Thanks very much.